So, welcome to this session, Open Source Philanthropy in the New Age of Collaboration. I did a very disservice to my colleagues who have illustrious CVs in introducing them in one sentence or less. But please, Silvia, Deval, please give us a sense of your background and where you're coming from. Just a couple of minutes each so that we can really dive into our conversation together.
I'll start. My name is Silvia Bastante, and I originally come from Peru. And one of my earliest memories was being driven to school in the morning and looking out of the window and seeing kids in the streets. And I didn't actually realize that they were poor and living in the streets. The only thing I could see is that they were not wearing shoes and they weren't forced to go to school. And I kept complaining to my mother, why is it that these kids are always out there and, I have to do this and I have to wear shoes and I couldn't quite understand that. But that, in a way, started my desire to always work in the space of trying to make the world somehow a better place. I studied government and economics, actually here in London, and then I spent a few years working for some of the large international organizations in Washington, D.C. I then moved on to work for Amnesty International, a major NGO, and after a few years, I realized that in many of these spaces, people have passion for having an impact, but I thought that the strategic planning and good management that is usually found more in the private sector was somehow not as present in the picture. So I thought, where can I learn the skills that I believe are missing in the development sector? I became a strategy consultant with the Monitor Group, did that for almost 10 years in different parts of the world. I then became the global head of philanthropy advisory for UBS, for the bank, helping wealthy individuals, many of them successful entrepreneurs in their own right, to allocate their resources for maximum impact. And that's when I really learned how philanthropy is such a dispersed effort. According to one of the latest studies that I commissioned whilst at UBS, done by Harvard University, more than 50% of foundations in the world have less than $1 million in assets and no paid staff. How on earth are we planning to deliver that types of capital that some of the successful social entrepreneurs need to change the world with that level of dispersion? In the United Kingdom, where we are today, I think the latest numbers I know is 160,000 voluntary service organizations or nonprofits in general. Do we really need so many? In the business sector, you would have seen a lot more consolidation. So this experience of advising very wealthy individuals on philanthropy led me to question, how can we deliver better forms of capital? And led me to join Co-Impact, which is where I'm now. And at Co-Impact, essentially, we have a pooled fund of collaborative philanthropists, Bill and Melinda Gates, Jeff Skoll, the Rockefeller Foundation, Nandan and Rohini Nilekani and Richard Chandler are our initial core partners. We have many others joining us at different levels of contribution, and we pool this funding to support places where there is already evidence of impact, very much what Alix was speaking about, in developing countries in the areas of education, health, and economic opportunity. And we delivered long-term, 5-year, unrestricted capital towards a plan that takes those innovations to scale to reach millions of people around the world. Let me stop there.
Thank you so much. Deval?
Great, yes. Similar to Silvia, I actually was born and brought up in Houston, but every time I would travel to India to visit my grandparents, my parents' family, I would be shocked with the disparity that I saw every single day in front of me. I'd question my parents, I'd question my family, and I was always told that this is the way things are. We needed to focus on other areas and enjoy with our family. But for me, looking at children who are my own age begging at traffic lights was something I just couldn't bear. And so I volunteered with the Street Children Program in Mumbai in 1996, went on to work at Morgan Stanley in New York. And it was there where I started reading about NGO founders in India, such as Preeti Patkar, who started the first night care shelter for children of sex workers. Kailash Satyarthi, who started fighting against child labor in rural Uttar Pradesh, or Javed Abidi, who's fighting for disability rights across the country. This is where I found that I would rather support these founders, these individuals who are creating social change, and provide them the same level of support I was doing at Morgan Stanley supporting private equity firms, but instead working with these NGOs, working with these founders, helping them with managerial support, helping them with flexible funding, helping them scale their ideas of social change. And that's really what led to the creation of Dasra 20 years ago.
Excellent. Wonderful. So you can see we have the perspective of both the private sector and philanthropy as well as founders. And hopefully myself, having founded a nonprofit myself as well back in a former life, I'll be able to add some value to this too. So let's begin. This is the interactive portion of things here. How many people agree with this statement? Did I go too fast? I went too fast. Yes, as a donor, I personally think the best grants have detailed budgets and lots of intermediate deliverables. Oh, look at this woke crowd.
You scared them into not saying
Leading the witness. I think that I mentioned a little bit at the end of my talk there how important it was for Deworm the World when that opening happened in India, that they had unrestricted resources that they were able to call on to be able to say, yes, we can have a National Deworming Day in 2 months from now, and we will be able to respond to that need. Because they had unrestricted resources. They didn't have time to go and find a donor and agree on a set of intermediate deliverables on that to really take that forward. And to me, that's a great example of the trade-off between, and maybe this is what you guys should talk about, the trade-off between control and alignment, which is what happens when you negotiate a budget and a lot of intermediate outcomes, versus, basically you're investing in a team and a strategic plan, but you have less control and maybe at some point less alignment when you do give core support to an organization. And maybe you want to reflect on that from Co-Impact's perspective as well as I think from Dasra's perspective as well. That'd be interesting to hear your thoughts.
For sure. So from Co-Impact's perspective, we're certainly on one end of the spectrum. We do very large grants that are normally around 25 million. In exceptional cases, we can go up to 50 million over 5 years. And these grants are given to really support systems change. And I know that Alix also mentioned the term. What we mean by systems change is something which is fundamentally different, where you can see a before and an after, but very importantly, which is sustainable in the long term. For us, that means necessarily either having the government adopt whatever solution and implementing it in the long term, or at least create something that is commercially viable and can go to scale that way. One of the issues in philanthropy is that everybody assumes that the major role of philanthropy is to fund the innovation. And it's great, you get to have a wonderful innovation that has evidence of impact, but that doesn't automatically scale. There's so many good things out there that are already working, but are working in a very small scale and have the potential for millions. So the type of funding that we do is certainly on one end of the spectrum. We do support the organizations that we choose to support. First, to go through a design phase in which we give them a certain amount of funding as well as some technical support, because many of these very successful entrepreneurs are spending more than 50% of their time fundraising, and they get given grants that are only a year at a time and very small amounts. So it's almost impossible for them to say, well, if I actually had guaranteed funding for 5 years at the tune of 50, 60, 70 million, this is what I could do, together with many other organizations and working with the government, right? So this is the space that we create. But once they have this investment prospectus, and once our core partners and the other funders that support us have agreed, then we really support them and we trust them in the way that you would if you have an amazing business plan and a very qualified leadership team in a business. And then it's really not about checking on the last little detail of the budget and what intermediate delivered. On a personal capacity, I'm involved with one nonprofit organization that works in South Africa, helping kids who live very close to the ocean but don't know how to swim to literally get in the water and experience the ocean, because that's a way for them to want to conserve it. And they were given funding by this European funder. And unfortunately, the car they used to transport all the materials broke down. So this little nonprofit organization decided to rent a car to be able to fulfill the mission of delivering the training to the kids. And when they sent the report to the funder essentially told them off massively, told them that they were going to rescind the grant and all of that because they had deviated from one line in the budget. I mean, seriously, what are we doing with this funding?
How do you see it from your perspective? Do you have donors who you've changed the nature of your relationship with over time, or interesting how you've seen this evolution for yourself?
Sure. No, I mean, I think one of the things we realized, again, from the very beginning is the trust that we have in these NGO founders and leaders is phenomenal. These are individuals who many times are from the same community they're trying to serve. They created an organization from scratch, not worrying about when is the right time to pledge their funding or when is the right time for them to get involved. They saw an issue right in front and they took that challenge up. And surprisingly, they were successful. They were successful without a plan. They were successful without resources. They were successful just because they had the grit and determination to actually solve what was in front of them. And so from a Dasra perspective, we like to find these organizations that have that track record, but may not have the funding for evidence, may not have had somebody to give hundreds of thousands of dollars for them to evaluate exactly what we're doing, but that's really where we come in. Earlier stage in these organizations to really support them with their plans, support them with building a management team around the founder, support them with HR or succession planning or finance, areas, again, that many times they're not strong on, but they're very strong in understanding the community, at creating innovation, and at ensuring that there's a feedback loop so they mitigate any sort of issues they see in front of them, as well as evolve as their communities evolve as well. And so for us, it's helping organizations create this, but to Silvia's point, it's all about trust at the end of the day, and making sure that you have trusted partners on the ground that are making the right decisions, and you're creating flexible sort of an atmosphere for them to be open about their challenges, and of course rolling up your sleeves to help them solve them.
Yeah. In that sense, it is like taking an equity stake in an early stage company, and you know that you want to be their partner, but know that they will inevitably have to find their way through net waters that you can't anticipate at the beginning. Okay, so there's another quote here. I challenge someone to send me a tweet and tell me that you disagree with this. Charities, donors, and foundations can be much more efficient to run and deliver change than government. The latter has too much red tape and is too inefficient. Many of us, I think, and I know in my career historically, I've also supported organizations that work around government to deliver an outcome that you think is far too critical to simply rely on low-capacity governments to deliver that service. And there's many nonprofits that have amazing evidence behind what they do and whose service delivery model fundamentally depends on saying the state is broken, I go around the state to deliver what I do. And I think it's a really actually important thing for us to all grapple with when we think about, are there ways that we can actually leverage and strengthen the state and without letting them off the hook? And I think your examples from teaching at the right level will be really interesting there. I mentioned that company CityTaps that we've invested in. One of the reasons I really like that investment is that it's not letting the utility off the hook. The utility is obligated to serve poor people this is in Mali, in the capital of Mali. That is their job. Now, they struggle to do that because people fall into arrears and you need to have a way to cut people off of their service, et cetera. But with this technological solution from CityTaps, now the utility can bring the people back on service, but they can do so saying, look, it's pay as you go. You got to pay for this, and we have a meter in place. Strengthens the utility's fiscal position, as well as brings those people back into service. So I love innovations like that, where actually you're not letting the state off the hook. You're just helping the state with a low capacity and low fiscal position to be able to do their job better. So I certainly think those are the kind of things to be excited about finding, and when you see those, to be able to back those kind of ideas. How do you see it? Maybe the teaching at the right level example in Zambia and other places might be useful to reflect on this.
For sure. And before I describe that example, I just wanted to say that, as many of you may know, one of the biggest criticisms of philanthropy these days is exactly about bypassing government. And this is what Anand, I think, will speak about later today. But also there's been many other thinkers in the space. And it is true that there are some circumstances, especially in failed states, where, you know what, there's still people out there and you need to provide humanitarian relief, and you can't do it with the government because it's non-existent or not capable. So there are circumstances in which that's the case. With Co-Impact, we focus on circumstances in which we can actually work up to a certain point with the local governments, because the money from philanthropy at the end of the day is really small compared to the numbers that government holds in most low and middle income countries. And therefore, if you can influence that funding, it can have a catalytic effect. The example of teaching at the right level that Alix was mentioning was one of our first grants, which we awarded in January of this year. We awarded 80 million in grants. It's our first round for 4 initiatives. One of them is teaching at the right level. And it goes back to the problem you mentioned of kids going to school but not really learning, because teachers usually, in some cases, do not have the good level of training, but also they have a class with 60 kids, and kids are at very different levels. They may have been bumped to the next year, even if they didn't learn anything in the previous year. And that's why you get amazing statistics of kids graduating school and not being able to do basic maths or read and write. It's not a tech-based solution. It's essentially teaching the teachers how to do differentiated learning within the same class by dividing kids into smaller groups and getting kids to help each other, as well as giving them exercises that are targeted to the level that they're actually at, regardless of their age or what school grade they are in. Relatively straightforward. Most governments are already doing training. This methodology was pioneered by Pratham, a major NGO in India, as well as MIT Poverty Action Lab. And our support is helping local NGO partners work with governments in some of the poorest countries in Africa, including Zambia and Cote d'Ivoire, to implement this program on a nationwide level. And there's been 7 randomized control trials on this methodology that shows that it really does work and increases the learning outcomes for the children. And regardless of what may happen in the future, regardless of the fact of digital illiteracy, if kids go to school and do not learn how to read and write and do basic maths, almost nothing else will help them. So for us, this is really, really important. And our investment is, I won't disclose the exact number, but it's not that significant compared to the money that these governments are already putting into training their teachers. And if with this little extra bit, you can have a much more significant effect. And that's without even reducing class sizes. We think it's something worth backing for sure.
That's a great example of taking something that for a very long time really was an NGO program in India, and Pratham has done amazing work there, but then saying the next generation of this really can be embedded in government programs in other contexts, and we have the evidence base to really back that up. Deval, I'm going to give you the last word to close us, but I'm also going to manage time a little bit and see if there are comments or questions that people in the audience have for our panelists, or reflections on your own journey, on maybe how your own views have evolved on some of these topics.
Sure. No, I'm happy to take the first answer. I mean, I think for us, it's again really realizing what the community needs first. And so, no offense to the conduit, but honestly, making decisions in this room for people who are sitting in rural India is probably not the right place. And so, I think really understanding again, who are the NGO leaders? What are they doing? What do the communities need? I mean, when I moved to India in '99 to start Dasra, the whole world was talking about bringing internet to the villages. And it was a very big thing. Yet most of the time when you go to these villages, you realize they don't have food, they don't have electricity, they don't have houses, they don't have medicine. Internet was the last thing that they needed in 1999. And so I think it's really important to find community-led organizations that know what's critical on the ground, that have a sense of what the community needs, because what they need is what also they're going to spend time on. And so I think as Dasra, we realized, again, very early on, it's not just the NGO leaders, but at the end of the day, it's the communities that we're all trying to serve that are working single-handedly to work themselves out of poverty. And so I think once you realize that they're in control, they're the hardest working, none of us are necessarily doing what they're doing. It's really important to have them guide the conversation, the dialogue, and the steps in terms of which interventions they want to focus on, versus us thinking in a conference room in Mumbai or in London, for that matter, that we have the solutions. So it's very much about finding what their needs are and taking their needs first and foremost, versus us implementing things that we've seen worked in different geographies but may not be critical for the communities at hand.
Maybe you should speak a little bit about, should we all start our own NGO and our own foundation, and how we can actually collaborate and come together?
So this is one of the, personally, yes, I see one of the major issues in philanthropy. Everybody wants to start their own thing. That's why we have such huge dispersion of efforts. The first thing I would say is, before you start your own thing, and you may have an amazing idea of what people in India may need or whatever, just look out and find out who's already doing that. And I think the service that Founders Pledge is offering its members of literally, helping them understand the landscape that they're coming into makes a lot of sense. And this is very much what we do at Co-Impact as well. We obviously have some major funders, but we also have some smaller funders that choose to join us for that journey of looking out in the world, what is already working, and finding solutions that they feel inclined to participate in. And they can bring not only their resources, but also their voice, their connections, their networks, their experience. So I think there are growing number of platforms. It's also the service that you offer within India. Very much what we are doing is leveraging other forms of funding. So I'll give you one specific example in the case of Liberia, which is one of the very poor countries in sub-Saharan Africa. We're instituting a program, or we're supporting a number of organizations to institute a program of community healthcare workers. So you mentioned that the mortality rate in the world is, you said 1 in 20? In Liberia, it's 1 in 7. And in many places in sub-Saharan Africa, it's still pretty high, especially in rural areas. Community healthcare workers as a methodology has been done for many decades by various NGOs, but always, usually NGOs. In Liberia, we're supporting a coalition led by Last Mile Health and a number of other organizations supporting the Ministry of Health. The funding that comes from Co-Impact is part of it. They're raising more funding from other funders, but also have the sustainer donors, such as USAID and others like the Global Fund as well, that will, over a period of 5 years, transition the whole program to the government hands with the long-term commitment from certain donors. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's precisely what we're trying to achieve.
Well, I think our time here is nearly up today, and so I'm so sorry we weren't able to take more questions. But I hope that, from the perspective of, we've been able to share some different perspectives from Global Innovation Fund, Co-Impact, Dasra, about our own journey as trying to be really smart people deploying capital on the behalf of bankers who have trusted us with that enormous and amazing responsibility. For myself, I take it very seriously that it's taxpayers' resources from the UK, US, Sweden, Australia that we deploy. It really behooves me to be really thoughtful and do in the way that I help our team to do that. So thank you all very much. I think it's time for a coffee break. We went over a little bit, but I got permission to do that. And find me on Twitter, and thank you all very much.